Welcome back to the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who are returning, it's great to see you again. As some of our Canadian colleagues will be familiar, it's common to start off seminar series with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As Chris has touched on, this Wellbeing Seminar Series is an initiative of the Canadian Happiness Economic Research Network. Our goal is to create a stronger sense of community for wellbeing researchers in North America and beyond. And we also have this idea that our seminar will take a stronger interdisciplinary perspective with researchers cutting across economics, psychology, sociology, public health, public policy, and other related disciplines. And we hope that by joining interdisciplinary collaboration, you will strengthen research in wellbeing science. For the upcoming 2024 to 2025 season, we're trying out a new format. So we're going to have a collection of 3-month mini-series, each exploring an active research question in your discipline. For the first 2 months of a 3-month mini-series, 2 invited speakers will each give a seminar presenting different perspectives on an open question. After both sides have presented their views, their data, their evidence, the 2 speakers will return in the 3rd month for a panel discussion for both perspectives to be engaging in dialogue about, the state of the current view, the interpretation of the evidence, and whether or not there's a path towards building, stronger sense of consensus. Our first mini-series will be on one of the most well-known findings in well-being science, the Easterlin Paradox. Our 2 solo speakers are Dr. Kelsey O'Connor today and Professor Claudia Senek on November the 12th, who will be presenting evidence against the paradox. They will then return and be joined by 2 other speakers for the panel on December 3rd. And today we're going to be kicking off with the first of the 3 seminars on the Easterlin Paradox with Dr. Kelsey O'Connor, who will be introduced by Chris. Chris, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Felix. It's my great honor to introduce Kelsey O'Connor. He is a leader and a rising star among a young generation of happiness economists that's bringing new energy and rigor and, I would say, and community to our field. Kelsey is a researcher at Statec Research, which is the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies in Luxembourg. He's also an associate editor at the Journal of Happiness Studies. He is the co-vice president of professional affairs and board of directors member for the ISQALs that I just mentioned, had a regional conference in South Africa last week. He's an advisory group member for the Center for Urban Wellbeing at the University of Birmingham. He's a senior research associate at the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. And he's a research affiliate of the German Institute of Labor Economics. And he's a Gallup research advisor. And I'm telling you all of this because he's relatively early in his career, as I mentioned. Correct me, Kelsey, later if I get the year wrong, but Kelsey earned his PhD in economics at the University of Southern California, I think in 2018, and studying with Richard Easterlin himself. And among several papers on economic growth and well-being since 2019, Kelsey has recently published an important reference work on the evidence about the Easterlin hypothesis, Easterlin paradox, in the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and Population Economics. And in 2022, he published, and both of these were with Richard Easterlin as co-author, published a paper in PNAS on time series on the time series of well-being in Europe. And well, maybe he'll mention you'll be seeing probably some material from both of those. That was covered in the Times in the UK. Kelsey, we're really looking forward to you kicking off our 3-part series and the launch of our new format, as Felix has mentioned. Thank you so much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I have to say that I have benefited so much from Richard. Um, I graduated in 2017, so it was one extra year. But success begets success. The networks that have opened up because I was Easterlin's student, people introduced me that way. So I think I've benefited quite a lot from that. And then I've had some fun. Part of the fun is interacting with you all, especially in person, but when possible, also online. I'll start right away, though, and thanks again to the organizers, Chris, as well as Sofia, Felix, and Anthony. I appreciate being here, especially to present Easterlin's work. So I'm, as mentioned, Kelsey from StatTech Research, the statistical office, but most of the credit really goes to Professor Easterlin. And we'll start right away, actually, with an image of him. So this is from 2018 when he retired from teaching. So he is actually still writing. He should have a book along with me coming out later this year or early next year, based on some of the work that's going to be presented today. It's relatively short, but I'm excited to have the opportunity to contribute to it. And also that Easterlin is still working. So he's 98 years old now. These are several of his students from the happiness sphere. So here's the original paper. It's now 50 years since it was originally published. And what many of you may not know, however, is that he didn't coin the term Easterlin Paradox. It actually came from this 1979 publication where the author states, it's Moses Abramovitz, states, he, that is Easterlin, reveals a contradiction in the reported association between income and happiness. And I propose this contradiction, the Easterlin Paradox. So it was actually Moses who comes up with this name, not Easterlin himself. And note that he very clearly states it's the contradiction in the reported association. It's not the time series relationship, which we'll get to shortly, and part of how people confuse this. So let's be more precise. The definition is that countries that have higher GDP per capita are on average happier. This is the cross-sectional relationship that most people agree upon. And the second part is that over time, countries with greater GDP per capita growth do not experience greater increases in happiness. So this is the time series relationship. This is the seeming contradiction. How do we explain both relationships simultaneously? And since this initial work in 1974, he's written on it several additional times, along with some colleagues. And they clarified in 2010 that it's the trends of GDP per capita and happiness that are unrelated. On the other hand, short-run fluctuations are positively related. And the easiest way to think about this is during economic recessions. So happiness, it's not surprising, declines when GDP declines during a recession. So what's the implication of the time series relation? As I mentioned, people tend to agree on the cross-section. So I'm going to focus most of this discussion on the time series, the more controversial part. So many economists and decision makers imply that GDP per capita growth unconditionally improves national well-being. This is really the heart of why the relationship is controversial. And some decision makers, economists, et cetera, go further and say that GDP per capita actually represents national well-being. Sometimes they say it's material well-being or economic well-being, and some even say it's just well-being. The challenge is, so if people do not lastingly feel better, they're not happier, in correspondence with greater GDP per capita growth, then growth is an incomplete goal, which gives rise to the Beyond GDP movement. This does not mean that we should drop GDP. Does not mean that growth is unimportant, but it illustrates clearly that GDP per capita does not represent a sufficient goal to make people feel better, nor does it represent well-being on its own. So, all right, that's the implication. How do we test this relationship? I'm going to try to be fairly precise, as I think most people refer to it without being precise. We're going to talk about subjective well-being. Right? So it's not well-being generally. And we're looking at it using national means of evaluative subjective well-being. So evaluative subjective well-being, in contrast to, say, affect, more related to emotional states, is, affect being one form of well-being, evaluative subjective well-being being another form of well-being. And then you could think about other forms, yet still, coming from, let's say, objective indicators or some, hypothetical latent concept. So it is, again, just one form of well-being, but I argue that it is the best single item metric that we have presently in a different piece. More specifically, we're going to look at life satisfaction coming from the following question. I think most of the audience will be familiar. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? We also use the Cantrell ladder coming from the Gallup data. It's also referred to as the self-anchoring striving scale, where it asks people to evaluate their lives on a ladder with rungs numbered from 0 to 10, where 0 represents the worst possible life for you, and 10 represents the best possible life for you. For brevity and relatability, we use the term happiness just to mean evaluative happiness. So we're not thinking about the affective or emotional state. We're thinking about evaluative, similar to how it's asked in the U.S. General Social Survey, or evaluative subjective well-being. So the relation to test, right? So if economists and decision makers imply GDP per capita growth unconditionally improves national well-being, we want to also look at an unconditional relationship. So that means we're not including any controls in our analysis. We're also using national well-being. This means the country level data. So the Easterlin Paradox does not apply at the individual level, and we may discuss that a little bit more as we progress. So what we're thinking about is a change in well-being as our dependent variable, and we want to look at that and how it relates to changes in GDP per capita across countries. So this is, say, country I. And the well-being here is the long-run average annual change in well-being. GDP per capita, the change here, so that's the average GDP, and it's also this average annual growth rate over the same period of time. So we're looking at changes and changes. We want to focus on the long run, not the short run, so what might be due to recessions, because we want tools that lastingly improve well-being. So does GDP per capita growth lastingly improve well-being? We need to look at the long run, not the short run. So to illustrate how we come up with this dependent variable, so the change in well-being, I have an example here from France initially. So this is across the left, life satisfaction, and time across the bottom, data coming from the European Value Study or the World Value Survey. So we have 6 data points for France, and what we do is we fit a trend line to the data, and we estimate the slope of this line. And what it does is it gives us how much life satisfaction is changing over this period of time on an annual basis. So here the estimate is 0.015 life satisfaction points per year. And that's what we use as the left-hand side variable as our change in well-being. Here's another example from Great Britain, where you see the line is much flatter and you have a change in life satisfaction of 0.003 per year. And then what we'll do is we'll compare this for a set of countries, also including their GDP growth rates. So in the case of Great Britain, it was 2.2 over this period of time, and in France, it was 1.7. So this would seem to suggest, to support the paradox, the time series relationship. But what, of course, we need is not just 2 countries. We need to look at a larger set of countries. So here are the new time series evidence. This is primarily in the chapter article that Chris mentioned. And I'll try to put perhaps a new spin on it, some new insight. This is data coming from the European Values Study World Value Survey. You have the annual change in life satisfaction across the left and the GDP per capita growth rate across the bottom. So you've got this big scatter, and you have a few countries marked with X that seem to be a bit of an outlier or set of outliers. And our job is to try to determine the relationship between these two variables. But first, I want to draw attention to these outliers and also the set of countries that we're going to look at, because each set of countries is a little different. And so developed countries, not too difficult to imagine what they are, and a lot of the evidence originally related to the developed countries. Transition countries are those countries that transitioned from communism to capitalism in the early 90s, and then less developed countries, based on really GDP levels. So ETCs are the expansion-only transition countries. So it's a special set of countries that I want to explain a bit more closely because the results hinge a lot on them. So here's Slovenia. On the left-hand side, you have life satisfaction, you have GDP on the right, and time across the bottom. Here you have the trend of life satisfaction and the trend of GDP. You see that GDP collapsed in the early 90s as a result of the collapse of communism. And life satisfaction is measured initially at the very bottom, the trough of the GDP series. And so life satisfaction is only measured in this country and similar countries only during the period of recovery and expansion from the collapse of communism. So what we pick up on is just the expansion. So we call them the expansion-only transition countries. Here's another way to observe it, and I'm going to add 2 more countries. So GDP on the left, time, but in relative years across the bottom. So you have, again, the collapse of GDP and its recovery. And then we had the first year of observation, as I mentioned, was at the same time period. Here's Russia, on the other hand. So Russia, we have an observation for life satisfaction going back 16 years before the trough in GDP. So in this case, we observe the full cycle, the full business cycle. So both the collapse and the recovery of GDP. Here's another country, Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is the latest observation of life satisfaction in our data set that is included in the sample. So the trough happens here, and life satisfaction is only first observed 6 years following. So this set of countries, and there are additional ones, these are just 2 examples, represent expansion-only countries. So we are observing, in this case, life satisfaction only over the period of time in which GDP per capita is growing, and it's partially this recovery period. So we separate these countries out from the others. Here's the full sample from the WVS EVS. So we have 13 total expansion-only countries, 10 full-cycle transition countries. So those are like Russia, 21 less developed, 23 developed. And you can see just kind of an illustration of some of the differences. So these are growth rates per year in GDP. So you had in the expansion-only countries, just ETCs for brief, a growth rate in excess of 5% per year. And the full cycle, because it includes the collapse and the recovery, you have a much lower growth rate. And you consistently have life satisfaction changing over time. The growth rates, and you have a larger growth in the expansion-only countries, partially because it's just during the recovery period and a shorter time period. You can see then the less developed and the developed countries, you have a longer period of time, generally speaking, with the developed countries covering the longest period, and also lower growth rates, not surprising. So this represents our set of data. So life satisfaction changes are the dependent variable, and the independent variable or explanatory variable is basically these GDP per capita growth rates. So back to our figure, but now the countries are broken into 2 sets. So you have the full cycle countries, and that's all of the countries except those expansion-only transition countries I mentioned, which you can see are outlying countries. And so if you fit a trend line just to the full cycle countries, you can see it's nearly flat. You have countries like Iraq, China, India. Those are, common examples where you have really fast growth, but virtually no change in life satisfaction. But then if you add in the expansion-only countries, then you have a tilt in the trend line where it looks like there's a positive relationship. However, the magnitude is fairly small, which I'll come to later. So one of the reasons why people might find different results is the inclusion of different sets of countries. We argue that these expansion-only countries really should be separated out, as they are, the life satisfaction is observed as recovering from the collapse in communism, and there are a host of things occurring in them at the same time. So changes in political institutions, you understand that there's a broad range of things changing from the shift from communism to capitalism. Here's the 4 set of countries, again, that I showed you before. And if we draw a trend line in each of them separately, you can see that actually they're almost all negative. So when you look at the ETCs by themselves, so Azerbaijan or Georgia, they have faster growth rates in economic terms, but they're experiencing lower life satisfaction changes than Moldova, Ukraine, or Macedonia, for example. And in the other transition countries, you also see a downward trend. And what is perhaps most surprising is the less or at least developed countries. Here, they also are experiencing they have a negative relationship, such that countries that grew faster in economic terms had lower changes in life satisfaction. Only the developed countries, which is again surprising, have a trend that is slightly positive, but it's still relatively flat. Now moving on to the Gallup World Poll data, so same kind of structure here. We don't have the full cycle necessarily. They're all experiencing, all observed starting in 2005 or 6, much larger growth rates. Note mostly just that we have a shorter time period as the data start in 2005 or 6. But they're still fairly sufficiently long to cover what would normally be considered a business cycle in a typical country. And for those of you who don't like figures or would prefer a table, I am showing the table now instead of the figure. And this first column replicates what you saw before. This is the WVS, EVS, if we exclude the expansion-only transition countries. And you see GDP per capita growth has a small insignificant relation. I'm going to add in these additional variables here now. So these are interaction terms. So GDP per capita growth multiplied by a dummy for the region for the expansion-only transition countries, et cetera. And these are dummy variables just for those sets of countries. So here you see that the growth relations, these interaction terms, are all negative. And that's consistent with the figure that you saw before. The only positive slope was in the developed countries, which is my omitted category. And so in each of these groups, the growth looks like it's even, the relationship is even less and as consistent. What is also rather interesting is the dummy variables for these groups of countries. So the expansion-only transition countries are experiencing a large increase in happiness over this period. However, the increase is independent of growth. The transition countries also large increase, less developed countries also a large increase, but it does not depend upon differing growth rates within those countries. In the words of another paper, it's referred to as an autonomous trend. So a change in happiness that is independent or autonomous as related to GDP growth. Here, bringing in the Gallup data now, you see that there's a slightly larger relationship at 0.002 compared to the 0.001. And this is not surprising given that it's a shorter time period, so you're capturing more of the short run relation. And now the largest relation is here, the interaction term on the transition countries and growth. This is the developed countries. So what we would have is the total relation in the transition countries would be the summation of the two. So you get the sum here, so 0.01. So this is the largest relation we observe across all of our estimates. And let's interpret that by looking at let's say a hypothetical change. If we move from, say, 2% per year in growth to 3%, or if we move from 3 to 4, we have a 1 percentage point increase. And what that does is it's associated with 1 times 0.01 life satisfaction points per year. So we take just our coefficient, multiply it by 1, and that's how life satisfaction changes per year in response to a shock. At that rate, it would take 100 years for life satisfaction to increase by 1 point. So based on this, and again, this is the largest magnitude that we observe across all of our relations. So this is only not even a fifth of that. So it would take 500 years according to this estimate. That growth is not, GDP per capita growth is not a good target to improve subjective well-being. And this is the main set of evidence that we use. There's a couple more tables in the original working paper and more figures. This is the main set of evidence that we use to support the time series relation as part of the Easterlin Paradox. So if anybody has questions on this, I can come back to slide 23. So greater GDP per capita growth rates are not meaningfully associated with greater changes in happiness in the long run. And this holds within each country group, including the less developed countries, which I'll come back to. Now, there are quite a few misunderstandings. The paradox very frequently gets quoted wrong. And of course, there are some critics, which is the point of this series. So in 2017, Easterlin wrote this paper, Paradox Lost, with the principal purpose of addressing the critics' claims. And I'm going to mention some of them here, although we're not going to go into each detail, as you can imagine. And the paper and the evidence that I've presented thus far is, building upon this 2017 article. So we try to address critics' concerns in that the Handbook chapter that I've presented evidence from. So first off, as an editor, I'm seeing just a huge number of people misrepresent the paradox, misunderstand it, and some of them focus solely on cross-sectional data, which misses the point of the paradox. And we need to have a contradiction in results. Some of them look at individual relations, so microdata, or the short run, not long run. Also, it's important to point out that short-run relations also result from fixed effects, and a lot of people get that wrong. So the estimation technique I showed you before, there may be alternatives, but the estimation technique really looked at this long period of, let's say, at least 14 years, and looked at changes, let's say, of 14 years with 14 years, not, say, 2 to 3 or 5. It's a bit different. And here's an illustration of why that's important. So we have income and happiness both here. Imagine it's an index on the vertical axis and time across the bottom. And here we have a peak in GDP or income and a peak in happiness. And as during a recession, GDP declines, happiness would also decline. During the expansion, GDP increases, so does happiness, but not to the same degree. And that's this solid line here, I should have mentioned. But what you see in the dashed line is the trend. So in general, GDP is increasing over time, whereas happiness is staying flat. Now, happiness doesn't have to stay flat, but in this case, it does, just to clearly illustrate that it's not related to income or GDP in the long run. And again, we're interested in the long run relationship because we want something that meaningfully improves well-being in the long run. So here's an example of some alternative views. So, the paradox has changed a little bit over time. People misquote it, misrepresent it in the literature. So Kasper Kaiser and Martin Bendrick present 5 different versions of the paradox and ultimately argue for the same approach that Easterlin used in the 2017 paper. That is, using a panel of countries to estimate the long-run relation between happiness changes and GDP per capita growth. They also exclude the Eastern European countries, which is similar to our definition of the expansionary and transition countries. They exclude it from their long-run analysis, and so does another set of authors. So it's not implausible what they're doing. There is some additional agreement coming from other researchers in the literature. Another important point is economic significance. So here, a paper by Beha, they state, this paper asserts that a rejection of the paradox must hinge on an affirmative answer to the question, does the estimated long-run relation, there's again the long-run, relationship between income growth and happiness indicate any economic significance? There's growing awareness among empirical researchers that we shouldn't be looking just at, is there statistical significance? As samples grow, we get more statistical significance, but is there anything meaningful that we can derive from that? So that's part of the reason why I described to you the magnitude that, even using the largest magnitude that we observe, it would still take 100 years for one additional point of growth to increase life satisfaction. So we're arguing that this is not economically significant, nor is it statistically significant in this analysis. Importantly also, happiness is not flat. The paradox does not state that. I showed you in my data that across each country group, we have happiness increasing, especially in the ETCs, but also the less developed countries. Easterlin argued in 2013 that it's the full employment and safety net policies that increase happiness. And we've since done some work to show this. Chris mentioned this paper in the introduction. Here, we're looking at 10 Western European countries and the change in happiness that has occurred over the nearly 40-year period from the early 1980s to the 2017-18. And you see that in the case of Spain and Italy, as well as France, they've had sustained large increases in life satisfaction. So it seems like this is possible and something we can strive for. However, in the case of Denmark and Sweden, they actually had declines. And part of that is because they were already fairly high in the 1980s, so it's hard to move up. But it is possible to have sustained changes over long-term periods. And in the paper, what we try to do is explain these changes and across all our time series and fixed effect regressions. So we do the same kind of long-run time series that was presented earlier, as well as fixed effects just for robustness. We find that the welfare state generosity is the only variable for which we find a significant relationship with the trend in happiness. We also test GDP and a couple of other variables. And again, it's only the welfare state generosity, which is similar to, say, social safety net policies. Building upon this set of research, not just my own, of course, but going back years, some authors have stopped asking if economic growth unconditionally increases well-being, and now instead ask under what conditions does growth increase well-being. And there's a few examples here. So what about a threshold or satiation point? So if you look at the recent work by the late Kahneman and Killingsworth, they in Deaton going back to 2010, I believe, they talk about a satiation or threshold in which happiness stops to increase with changes in income. Of course, we're looking at country level data, so it's different than the individual data, but people also get it wrong here. And our analysis shows that even in the less developed countries, greater growth rates of GDP does not relate to greater growth rates of life satisfaction. And here's a couple of notable examples. Japan, it was from 1950, almost 1960, was a less developed country at the time and has a fairly flat change in happiness, even though it was growing rapidly economically. China, you can see it's a bit U-shaped. You'll know, of course, that they were growing very rapidly along with India. India had a decline. So even in less developed countries, maybe not all countries, but even in less developed countries on average, growth rates was not improving life satisfaction. All right, so what's the explanation? There's one explanation I don't think has been discussed very much, and it borrows from here a paper by Easterlin in 2013. So some of you may not know there is such a thing as an Easterlin hypothesis. It's actually related to demography and separate from the Easterlin Paradox. And also he was an economic historian and demographer as a big part of his background. So this draws from his economic history. And the title of the paper is Cross-Sections Are History. So across countries today, national happiness is related to GDP, in part because of this, what's called the Head Start hypothesis. But let me explain. So the geographic diffusion of production technology, which gave rise to the GDP growth, and social science, which gave rise to happiness growth, we argue elsewhere, followed a similar pattern around the world, starting in Northern and Western Europe and spreading from there southward and eastward across Europe, and then throughout the world. So let me be a little bit more precise here. So the countries that first experienced strong economic growth also had strong institutions. And more than a century later, because the growth, modern economic growth in GDP occurred long before the growth in happiness, we can speculate at least, and we have some evidence for, so those countries that had strong institutions were the first to implement policies to support economic stability, employment, workers' protections, welfare state policy, and the social safety net. So it is these countries that implemented policies ultimately to promote well-being. They may not have been thinking that that was their goal at the time, but the byproduct is that they were increasing well-being or happiness. And it took time for this technology to diffuse around the world. But this did not strictly depend on GDP. So I think it was Bismarck in Germany in the 1860s, Costa Rica today have strong welfare state policies, but do not have the same levels of GDP that might be thought necessary. Also, similar to this diffusion of, let's say, economic and happiness technology, you might say, health and sanitation was diffused around the world. So life expectancy is positively related to GDP today, but the improvement in life expectancy over time was not dependent upon GDP growth. And Easterlin and I have this forthcoming book, which I mentioned, which talks about this in some more detail. I have to give credit again to Easterlin, but I was very happy to contribute to the work. So social comparison is another example, I think, that you can easily understand and recognize, especially with this picture. So while you might still have something nice, it doesn't feel the same when somebody has something nicer. And let me make it a little bit more precise. So here you can imagine an equation of happiness for an individual and how it depends on your own income as well as reference income. Reference income can be your past income as well as the income of others. So here the estimate is that this is positive, so those who earn more are happier, which is part of the cross-sectional, part of what explains the cross-sectional result for individuals. At the same time, higher reference income reduces your happiness. So if over time, economic growth, if it were equally distributed, it causes both your own income to go up as well as reference income to go up. And then if these relationships are similar to each other but in opposite directions, then income growth has no meaningful impact, in aggregate on happiness over time. So one potential explanation, and this is coming back to a couple of papers which are perhaps well known to the audience. Here's another way to look at it graphically for those who don't like the equations. We have subjective well-being on the left and different income levels across the bottom. And then we have different aspiration levels here. So it's not exactly the same mechanism, but it's strongly related. So here you have, imagine that we're starting at 0.2. So we have a happiness level and an income level, but then income goes up. If income goes up, we are now at Y2 and we are happier at U2. However, this is only going to stay this way if our aspirations stay the same. And so that also is, and the aspirations are partially driven by your reference levels. So the income of others, as well as your what you have personally adapted to or come to expect. So if aspirations then instead move over time from A1 to A2, we go back down. So you have higher income, but the same level of happiness as you had before. This goes back in time to actually preference shift, as discussed by von Prague and hedonic adaptation. I think many of you will be familiar with. And the figure comes from Easterlin's work in 2001. Alternatively, we have an explanation coming from negative externalities. So here you can think of, let's say GDP per capita was increases in that was helping people. People felt happier, but there were negative trends that offset this increase due to GDP. So you could think of income inequality, environmental degradation, and social capital decline as potential factors that offset the benefits from GDP. And Bartolini, Bilancini, and Pugno use this explanation in a 2013 article referenced here. There are others that do similar. So imagine that we take the previous equation that we had before and then just augment it to add negative externalities with beta 3 here. And now you can imagine that if beta 2 and beta 3 are both negative, they could offset the benefit from beta 1. Further, some authors have argued that economic growth may even be the cause of these negative externalities. And this is the premise behind defensive growth theory, which I've contributed to a little bit with several other authors here. And now there's additional evidence to support this. So my colleagues at StatTech show that unequal economic growth, so this is economic growth in countries with high income inequality, actually increases distrust, or so this is a decline in social capital. I think many of you will be more familiar with the work on environmental activity or degradation. So human activity has caused a decay in biodiversity. And then there's the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, showing that human activity has negatively influenced the climate at large. So these are negative externalities that growth has to offset in order to improve happiness. So coming to the conclusion, so the evidence, when appropriately considering the trends of happiness and GDP, has been consistent over the past 5 decades of research now. GDP alone does not contribute meaningfully, if at all, to happiness in the long run. And it's now based on data for more than 120 countries, of which many are less developed. And the explanation is likely multifaceted. So due to a history and how technology is diffused around the world, social comparison, and changing aspirations, as well as negative externalities. Thankfully, we do have examples of when happiness increases and some understanding of when that happens. So Easterlin first said full employment and social safety net policies, and we supported that at least in 10 European countries over a long run analysis using the generosity of the welfare state. So kind of moving beyond the Easterlin paradox a little bit. So the result or the implication is that targeting GDP alone is insufficient to increase national subjective well-being. And through beyond GDP movements, we can move from a vicious cycle of keeping up with the Joneses to a virtuous one. And we talk about this in other work. It's my colleague. So we should focus instead directly on the determinants of well-being and cooperation to achieve a more environmentally and socially sustainable world. We should remember that GDP is intended as a tool to measure economic activity and could be thought of as a tool to promote well-being, but it should not be the end-all, be-all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. This series is 3 hours is going to be a short amount of time for this series. We have 10 minutes left. I'd love to open it up to questions, although I have ones I will start off with myself if I don't see hands very soon. Moving from the applause, of which there's a bunch, to questions. So if you'd like to ask Kelsey a question, please do. Okay, you just beat me to it. Dalia, go ahead.
Yeah, very cool work. I'm unfamiliar with this area, and I was just curious how you explain the shorter term, the fact that like over a year or two with the recession, happiness is linked to GDP.
Yeah. Easterlin wrote about it relatively recently. One example is psychological, another is debt obligations. For example, so you have a mortgage and you're unable to make your mortgage payment. So that's and debt really is a major consideration in North America. Another one, the psychological, is prospect theory. So in general, we like income, and it's at the individual level, but the benefit we gain from, or the benefit we experience from an increase in income is not as large as the symmetric loss. So if we lose, $10, it has a bigger impact than gaining $10. And it takes time to adjust to these things. So your lifestyle, for example. And I could probably go on a little bit, but for sake of time, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Ken?
Kelsey, I enjoyed your presentation, very clear and very meaningful. Just two comments. I really liked the fact that you brought in aspirational variables, dimensions to the research, because I've always felt that aspirations are not fully specified in most statistical models that measure happiness or other factors. So I was very pleased and surprised that you've done that, because it helps explain a lot of things, including the transition countries, the happiness. When I was looking at the data recently that show the biggest increase in happiness taking place in what are transition countries, it was obvious that a lot of this increase in happiness is not because of economic variables, but other variables. More liberty, more freedom of people, and aspiring to becoming a wealthier, more stable country. So I'm very happy with your presentation and the conclusions that you've drawn. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. So,
John. Oh yeah, Kelsey. Sorry, of course.
I'll just say real quick. Unfortunately, I don't have a direct measure of aspirations, but it is included in the understanding of subjective well-being. So subjective well-being depends upon aspirations. How you understand your life depends upon, let's say, reference income as an example. And I would just note that in the Eastern European countries, those that transitioned, you'll have to remember that we're observing them at a very specific period that they had just collapsed. So their recovery is larger than what you would have expected otherwise, because you're missing part of the information. We don't have what was before. Okay. But thank you, Ken. John?
Kelsey has a very nice presentation of very inspiring research. I was a little surprised by you using the term externalities, where I would just say other factors. Externalities suggest it's a consequence of the economic growth. You have a subcategory of places where that is clearly argued and is the case. But in my view, the economists, and you're reflecting an economist's approach to this, overestimate the inevitability of the economic determinants. Psychologists are much less likely to do that, in which case you say, well, it doesn't have to be anything to do with economic growth. It could be negatively affected by economic growth if you're having that, but it might not be. It might be other things. In particular, we continue to find in a variety of places the primacy of social relations and social norms, including benevolence. And then the question is, how important are they in relation to other factors? And then if you're taking the economist perspective, you then want to say what aspects of economic development are positively or negatively affected, the relations that people have with each other, which are, in my view, the primary determinants of well-being. That part of it seems to be not central to the story, although it seems emerging in your latest papers out of StatEc.
Thank you. So I agree with you. I used the word externalities in part because I had an idea in my mind, but really it's other factors. You're absolutely right. So we do show that there are some negative externalities, and that's, so I mislabeled the slide title. So one of those externalities in the recent work by Francesco and Giulia show that there is distrust coming from growth. And so that was part of the reasoning. But I agree with you. And there is work by Becchetti, Bartolini, Francesco Saracino, right? So a few of them who use social capital at the same time they look at growth. And they are able to explain the relationship that way. So I recommend those papers. There, especially one really clearly distinguishes the short, the medium, and the long run. And it's one of the only papers I'm aware of that does that. So I agree with you, and love to talk more if you'd like to discuss some those specific papers.
There's.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. I thought that was a great presentation. I think you made a very strong case that GDP is not meaningfully connected to increases in happiness over the long run. And my question is how you concluded it, because at the end you said that GDP can be considered a tool to increase well-being, but should not be the end all. And I'm wondering why it seems like you did a pretty strong job of suggesting that there should be no focus on GDP, and then the end you gave up on that a little bit. You relented a bit and suggested, well, maybe we could still use GDP as a tool. So I'm curious why you approached it that way.
Sometimes I refer to myself as a capitalist, and people around me hate hearing that. So I'm still in love with economics and think that GDP is important and can be used appropriately, let's say. So it's, and you might recall, I should have made slightly more emphasis. It's this unconditional relationship between GDP and happiness. And so actually, John Hallowell talks about the quality of growth. So if we had growth that was not unequal, that was not related to various forms of social decline or environmental decline, I do think that it could be used or we could benefit more. And I spoke to Easterlin somewhat recently about the role of social comparison. So if we could reduce the role of social comparison, then I think also we could benefit more from growth. So I don't think we have to give up on it. There's more that we can say. I am worried about the environment, et cetera. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
This may be related, and I like this phrasing from Kristen. And Kristen, go ahead.
Hi, I can lower my hand. I don't necessarily have to be the one to say the question, but thank you. Yeah, thanks for the talk. And I'm convinced it's not a sufficient condition that that when GDP grows up unconditionally, happiness goes up. But might it be a necessary condition? Kind of just thinking about the potential with technological change for things to be better. So the thought of giving up on kind of economic or narrowly construed kind of material well-being not getting better doesn't seem like a great goal either. So I wonder, any evidence you have about maybe a necessary condition perspective on this relationship?
Yeah, it's a nice distinction. I appreciate that. So we've looked at, let's say, unconditional relationships with other variables. And so then we're ignoring the role of GDP. Now, over the long run, in all of the countries we're looking at, GDP has been increasing. So we're thinking about a hypothetical world in which it doesn't increase. And so then I don't really know. I do believe that some of the, let's say, circular economy, donut economics, neo-humanism, so these other concepts of maybe not degrowth, but much lower growth, I think it is possible to get there. But we have a very, very long way to go in my mind. And so I'm, broadly speaking, working towards cultural change to make that maybe more acceptable.
So you don't think it's a necessary condition then, reading between the lines, although you don't have any evidence because we don't really see it. Is that a fair summary?
In the future, I think that, let's say, current growth rates are not necessary.
Thanks.
This is a wonderful place to leave it, given that we've hit our time. I'm going to hand it over to Anthony just to close and tell you about what's next. But Kelsey, this is, thank you so much for your expert contributions in the field and for articulating this kickoff to our series. I'm so excited to have you back in 2 months. Anthony.
Yes, thank you as well, Kelsey. I'll echo what Chris said there. That was an excellent talk. This is such important work for the kind of foundation of the field, and it's amazing to have you present it here for us. I'm getting the feeling a good discussion is going to ensue over the next 3 months. Thank you for coming to this first session of this sort of mini-series and the first session of the McGill UofT Wellbeing Research Seminar for this year. The rest of the series is going to take place over the next 2 months. So on November 12th, we'll have our next session where we'll be joined by Professor Claudia Senek, who's going to give a different sort of viewpoint on GDP growth and happiness. And then on December 3rd, we will have both of our speakers back and maybe some other speakers for a panel discussion talking about kind of where this question is at right now. Yeah, please share the seminar with colleagues that you think would be interested. Get the word out there. We're still young. And we're looking forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks for joining us.